Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, we proudly bring to you Mormonism Live!
Shut up and sit down.
Good evening, Mr. Reel. How are you doing?
I can't hear you through all that applause. What was that, RFM?
I was saying you look marvelous tonight, Mr.
Hey, look
Reel.
at that. A little hot pink in the name of strong female voices in Mormonism, which is what we're going to be pointing to some strong female voices tonight. But before we get started in tonight's topic, any thoughts from you on anything going on in your life?
Yes, absolutely. This Saturday is a big day, Bill. Maybe you've heard of it. It's January 22nd, 2022. It is Worldwide Thrive Day.
Yeah, I'm going to be in Las Vegas at the Vegas Thrive, speaking there. I hear you've got a special assignment.
Yeah, Bright Light City, going to set my soul on fire.
Will it be raining there in Seattle?
Almost certainly. There's an old saying up here that there's a way to tell the weather. And if you can see Mount Rainier. No, if you can't see Mount Rainier, it's raining. And if you can see Mount Rainier, it's going to rain.
Welcome to Seattle, Washington.
No, actually, I think we're going to have good weather this weekend. I am working on my presentation almost even as we speak. I've gotten some magical supplies that I had to order because I lost all the stuff I had when I was a kid. And hopefully I'll be performing some magic and relating it in some way or other to the subject of Mormonism. Hence the title of my speech, Magic and Mormonism.
Yeah, that almost sounds a little D. Michael Quinn-esh.
Yes, it isn't. Well, it is kind of, except this magic is not the folk magic. This magic is, well, you know what magicians do.
Real
Tricks.
magic.
It's real magic. And if you look at this, okay, so here's something I probably won't be doing, but you know, it's the old ball and vase trick, right? I don't know if you can see this, but this vase has a ball in it. It's a blue ball, right? So we take that out. We make that vanish by something miraculous or other. Place this back over the top, right? Snap the fingers, and lo and behold, what has happened? But, oops, sorry, I took it out of the camera view. The ball is back.
Look at that.
It's an amazing thing. Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm not going to tell you how I did that, because I don't want to spoil the secret.
So if you want to see some radio-free Mormon magic tricks, go to Seattle, Washington's Thrive this coming weekend.
Oh, it'll be worth the price of admission, I guarantee.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, life is good. The show is rolling along, and tonight we wanted to talk about ERA. And I don't mean earned run average from baseball. We're not going to be talking any sports tonight.
Well, you're talking about the Church Magazine, the New Era.
No, something very different from that. So I will bring on our guest. This is Kelly Whited-Jones and my good friend Jana Spangler. Let me make sure you guys are muted. You are. How are you guys doing tonight?
Doing great.
Really great. Glad to be with you.
Good. You know, this is a topic I've been wanting to cover personally for some time now. And I'll give you my little preface, and then we can jump into you guys introducing each other. Introducing yourselves, to the audience. And the thing that I've been thinking about for years now and been wanting to kind of get to cover this topic is this idea that Mormonism often tries to paint itself as being a major factor in helping Utah to be at the forefront of women's rights. And we'll get into some of the quotes and some of the things that have been said, some of the things that have happened. But my understanding sitting back is there's a very different story to be told, as well as us understanding where things are at currently in the state of Utah with women's rights. And why don't we, before we jump into the questions, why don't we allow each of you to kind of introduce yourself? Kelly, would you get us started?
You bet. So Kelly Whited-Jones, I've been working on the Equal Rights Amendment now since about 2016. But I've kind of always been a Mormon feminist, even if I thought I was the only one for many years. I kind of got started with the Equal Rights Amendment. The first time I heard about it was growing up. My sister actually left our religion when Sonia Johnson was excommunicated for her support of the Equal Rights Amendment. So Sonia Johnson headed up with the Mormons for ERA. Here's my lovely badge. And when she was excommunicated for her support of women's rights, that's when my sister sort of left the church. So I grew up really feeling like hushed tones. It was talked about in really, it was almost like saying a swear word at my house. So we didn't really learn a lot about it until I left, went to college, started to read the actual language of the ERA, and thought, how in the world? This is so simple, so reasonable. How is it that we are still waiting to have this certified?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just a little bit about me. I have 3 kids. I'm a professor. I teach at the University of Utah and at Salt Lake Community College in communication. And I grew up in Orem and now live in North Salt Lake. So I understand about kind of conservative geography. And I'm grateful to have the chance to work for women in our state.
Yeah, wonderful. Jana, a lot of the audience is going to know who you are. I know that I've had you on multiple times to be a wise voice in various episodes of podcasts that I've been part of. Jana, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Jana Spangler, and I live in Salt Lake City. I am an integral life coach with Symmetry Solutions. I work directly with people who are dealing with faith transition. It's something that I myself have been through, and I was so excited to be invited to this particular conversation. I'm really interested in politics, and I have kind of an interesting history myself with politics. In 2008, I was raised in a very, very conservative home politically, where feminism, ERA, they were dirty words in my home growing up. And as recently as 2008, I was serving as, actually, I think in 2010 also, I served as a Republican delegate in Utah. And since I've gone through faith transition, by 2016, I was attending the Women's March in Washington, D.C. So I kind of have political whiplash a little bit, but I feel like it brings a lot of maybe recent experience with different political ideals, especially as it deals with feminism and the ERA, because a lot of that has blown up for me since I went through a big shift in perspective.
Yeah. I want to jump into it, and I'm going to start way back in time, and I'm hoping maybe you guys can give us a bit of a history lesson as well. And as I ask questions, whichever one of you wants to kind of jump in and take the lead, and wherever you want to kind of add something, feel free. But let's go back into early Utah statehood, and when Equal Rights Amendment first begins to kind of make some noise. And I want to go back to even further where we're talking about women's right to vote, and the timeline of kind of when that happens, and the role that Utah plays, and some of what's going on at the time that gives context for why the state of Utah did things the way they did things when they did them. Any thoughts from the two of you to get us started kind of in that direction?
You bet. I don't mind jumping in here, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Utah has a great history, I think, with equal rights in general. So if we think about back to Emmeline B. Wells and her work with the Women's Exponent, which was really one of the first periodicals west of the Mississippi. And she was the editor of that paper for 37 years, and prior to becoming General Relief Society president. And her efforts for women's suffrage in particular, but for women's rights in general, was fantastic. If you've ever gone back and looked at, I had to look at it on microfiche at the University of Utah, but if you've looked at some of the articles that she wrote, she did not have a problem calling out current church leaders, voicing very strongly that women needed to have pronounced rights. And I think her difficulties with polygamy certainly factored into that. She was kind of the unfavored wife in some ways, and so had to support herself financially And I think she understood, I think on a powerful level, the ways that women were really suffering and from the inequalities in our community, just right as we got started here in Utah.
Kelly, I don't mean to throw you off your track or anything, but what you said made me think of a quote that Maven brought to my attention just earlier today. And it involved the exponent, but it was a modern day quote from Sister Bingham, I'm pretty sure it was. And she was talking about how great a history and up to the present, apparently, the church has in supporting and promoting women's rights, and gave us an example. This Exponent magazine, which was run by women and published by women, and giving that as an example of how great the church has been about women's rights. Do you have any reaction to that?
Well, when I think about Emmeline and those that were even my ancestors who came here and worked hard for suffrage to take place, I think that they couldn't really be denied. I think when you have pulled the wagon train with your husband, with your spouse, then it's interesting to me to see how things have shifted, I think, over time. So I think in that time period, there was a sense that we're going to respect women. We're going to support them in this effort. Certainly, there were other motivations around polygamy and statehood for that support of women's suffrage initially and women's rights too. But I think there was a difference back then. And I think we have lost a little bit of that, I think, along the way.
Yeah, when I see this quote from Sister Bingham, it strikes me that what she's talking about is something that happened 100 years ago. And she's sort of saying it in a way that it applies since 100 years ago. But it doesn't seem like the church has continued in that trajectory of protecting and promoting women's rights. If anything, it seems to have gone the opposite direction in the intervening 100 years. Your thoughts?
I mean, I can speak to that. I think that's my perception as well. That's absolutely true. That late in the 19th century, women in Utah actually did have some extraordinary rights for the time, beyond just the right to vote. They also had the right to own property. They had the right to conduct business. They had the right to file for divorce based on incompatibility. And actually, a Mormon woman was the first in the nation elected to the state senate. And she actually defeated her own husband in 1896. So I think that I definitely had that perception that they started out pretty progressive in women's rights, but it was somewhere, I'm thinking around the 1920s, that women started seeing that in Utah, started to see that slip away. And this strong idea of family values and the traditional, Mormon family started to come online, and women, largely the leadership of the church, went along with it and felt like this was the correct order of God, that the Relief Society being subordinated was to the church and losing some of its autonomy was actually a good thing, because the priesthood was supposed to be presiding.
I'm curious, you guys, on the role that polygamy maybe plays in some of that early support of the things you just laid out, and including the women's right to vote. Your thoughts on how maybe polygamy helped those things happen, or assisted those things, or at least played some sort of role?
I do think that as women have come into leadership positions, they cannot help but see the inequalities that women in our state face. And I think so it's interesting to see them shift their thinking. So as more women did gain the right to vote, and then more were introduced to political life, I mean, we started out in our state constitution an equality clause. We were only the second state to have an equality clause. And it reads very similarly to the Equal Rights Amendment. It has that same sentence, shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. And it's listed in our state constitution, but it under political life, but it defines both political and civic engagement. So there's been some suggestion, hey, we've had this this equality clause kind of buried in our state constitution since the beginning. But now we're looking at a reality for women in our state where we regularly come in last on equality metrics. So Wallet Hub is an economic magazine that periodical that rates and each state based on about 12 or 13 standards to determine if they're good for women's equality. And we consistently over the last 4 years have come in last. I think Idaho was dead last this time, so we were second to last this year. But there's a real disconnect there from sort of insisting that women's rights be in our state constitution, something that we lost, right? We lost statehood because of polygamy. So women like Emmeline B. Wells had to win it twice. They had to work double hard to gain that right to vote because they lost it due to polygamy.
I don't want to accelerate you too fast in your timeline, but there are so many things that seem counterintuitive here with a culture practicing polygamy and treating women, well, in some regards, very much as property and objects. And on the other hand, giving them suffrage, giving them the equal rights clause in the Utah State Constitution. But my question that I have is, why would it be that the same church that put the equality clause in the state constitution, fast forward then to the 1970s, and the church comes out and takes an official position against the Equal Rights Amendment, which seems to be very similar to that clause in the Utah State Constitution? Why do you think that is?
Jana, do you want to start?
I mean, I don't know that I'm a history expert on this kind of a thing, but, I just can't help but connect it to this, strong backlash that the church itself had to the reforms of the 60s. I was born in 1972. I've seen several analyses of, wording in general conference, and a lot of the way that the church was talking shifted in the early 70s and then just really sped up in trying to save people, save the family from these horrible things that were happening in the world. And so I just can't help but think that this cultural shift and Ezra Taft Benson coming in and a lot of the political right and being connected to the John Birch Society and all of that led up to the situation we're in now. That really we're making tiny steps, just painfully slow away from it, but it's put us in such a bind when it comes to any equality between the sexes.
And are you talking inside the church or outside the church or both?
I mean, I think that it's probably both. I think it's probably the church for sure within the church, but also just the Christian right in America. I mean, as I kind of was doing some reading up on the ERA to get ready for this, I mean, like Phyllis, what's her name?
Schlafly.
Schlafly. I can't say her name.
Schlafly. Is it Schlafly?
Schlafly, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, Phyllis Schlafly. I mean, she was not an LDS woman, but boy, we just kind of fell right in line with the Eagle Forum and with what a lot of the Christian right was doing. So,
absolutely. In fact, Phyllis Schlafly came here and met with Barbara Smith in 1974 to lobby against the Equal Rights Amendment. And Barbara actually then went, she was a president at the Relief Society at that time. She went and talked to the leadership, asking them to really take a position. And I think that's pretty dramatic. I think that there's a reckoning that needs to take place around the ways that Mormonism has worked in a concerted effort, an organized way to really prevent women's full equality under the law. That has to take place. Certainly that happened in the 1970s. And the church, they went pretty far with it. They created a committee that was devoted just to stopping the Equal Rights Amendment. And some of our later prophets served on that committee, including Gordon B. Hinckley as a young man. So there's a long history there of of putting roadblocks in the way of women as they were working for greater equality, so much so that women were given callings. They were bused to conventions to vote no on all the measures that would support women's equality. This was in 1975 to 1977.
And this is thousands of women, is that right?
Absolutely. They had projected for one of the conferences that they would have 3,000 women. The church asked women to and bussed them in. There were 12,000 women that converged on this conference, meaning that any of the measures that were brought forward were immediately voted down, even some that had nothing to do with the Equal Rights Amendment.
By the way, I think maybe we need a little bit of background here, which is that this is an amendment, a proposed amendment to the Constitution, which means that the Constitution provides for the way it can be amended. There has to be, first off, passed by the federal legislature, and that's by a supermajority vote. Isn't that correct? In both houses?
Right, right.
So there's the first hurdle, because we can amend the Constitution. It's just not supposed to be easy for obvious reasons. But then once it was passed by the federal legislature, and what year was that?
1972.
Thank you, 1972. Then there's a process. The second part is that 75% of the state legislatures then have to vote to ratify it. Now, does the vote in the state legislatures also have to be a supermajority, or is it a simple majority? Do you know?
I believe it's a simple majority.
Okay,
So
but 75%.
38 states.
Yeah, 38 states, right? Because you round up to get to the 75%.
Right.
And so my understanding then is that there were 20 some odd, and you'll know the exact number, 20 some odd states that relatively quickly ratified it. Is that right?
Right.
But then it started to slow down. And right now, what we're talking about the church busing thousands of women to a convention, are we talking about the ratification attempt in Utah or something else?
So something else, but it was declared the year of the woman. And so many of the efforts that the Equal Rights Amendment passage had kind of kicked off, and some of the gains that had put in process were being voted on. And so it was a moment, it was a really powerful moment for women to come together in these conferences and vote on some of these measures. So yeah, Congresswoman Karen Shepard, only our second Congresswoman here in Utah to be elected, she was part of that effort. And she described it this last summer as just being devastated. The women who were involved in putting this conference together had worked so hard over many, many months to put this together, and then to have it just absolutely ruined was devastating for so many women here in Utah.
You said this was recently?
No, 1974.
Okay, we're still back in then.
Right,
okay, 1974.
Yeah.
And it was ruined by the church busing in all these Mormon women with orders to vote against? To vote against any of the measures. Some of them were not even to do with the Equal Rights Amendment, but were progressive, were going to elevate the status of women here. And they just voted straight no on everything. So that was a pretty tumultuous time for the Equal Rights Amendment. It did come into the legislature a little bit further on, but the night before it was being proposed in the 1975 legislature, the Mormon Church News published a statement in opposition to the ERA. And that's overnight. Like, they had really great support at that time. There was a really good shot to get it through. But support for the ERA just through that announcement, the Utah House of Representatives dropped from 36 votes yes to 16. So just through that announcement, something that has actually been echoed more recently in some of our current efforts. We had a similar situation. And was that the result then of what you were talking about with Phyllis Schlafly, who was really, at least the female figurehead, as far as I can recall, and I don't recall much, but I know that she assumed a prominence, I think, through this that lasted for decades after that. I think she had a syndicated column. I don't know, maybe she still does, but still very much a vocal proponent of whatever it is she's proponenting. But so it went from Phyllis Schlafly to the Relief Society president, Barbara Smith, then to the president of the church?
The leadership of the church at that time.
Okay.
And then these committees were formed, not unlike what was done around Prop 8 in California. So a situation where Relief Society meetings were held directly to oppose, and people were called to callings to go door to door and dissuade women from participating.
Yeah, it seems like even Prop 8 on steroids, in that the church is not even trying to be behind the scenes about it, not even trying to not draw attention to themselves. I don't know, they did a great job. But here they're coming out and actually issuing a publication saying this is the position of the church. We are against the ERA.
Right. Publishing that. And then that immediately had an impact in the legislature. And I think that's the really telling part and the difficult part that we deal with still today is that we have a large population of those lawmakers and policymakers that are part of the LDS Church and really represent a real far right perspective on this. And so when the church comes out and makes a statement, I'll just tell you, in 2016, when we were putting this forward for the 2017 legislative session, we were told regularly that the LDS Church would not make a comment. It was consistently a no comment. In 2018, when Karen Kwan brought her bill to the fore, we got the same thing, no comment. We will not be making a comment on the Equal Rights Amendment. And that was true the night before she announced her bill. It was true the morning that she announced her bill. But at the time we met at the Capitol by 1:00, suddenly there was a comment, and all the headlines were that the LDS Church still opposes the Equal Rights Amendment.
And I'm sorry, this is 2018?
2018.
Oh, I wasn't even aware of this.
Yeah. So in 2016, Senator DeBacchus brought it back with a group called Utah Women Unite. And we were able to have the largest march for women in Utah's history that year at the Capitol. And a huge effort to push it through. It got held in Rules Committee, and it's been presented every year to our legislature. But that no comment, and then suddenly a comment was a concern. Although what they did say was, we haven't reconsidered our position in 40 years. And I would suggest that most decisions that haven't been reconsidered in that amount of time really should be.
Yeah, I want to go back to the 70s for a moment, and
don't we all?
Yeah, well, yeah. I'd go to the 80s, but let's go to the 70s for a moment. So, and it's going to take me a moment to kind of get this thought out, which is, as I'm looking at the outline that we put together for tonight, there's some quotes that are inserted that I want to read a couple of these because it points to what you're talking about, and I want to draw a connection, which is when we started the show, we're talking about Mormonism and Utah and them separately and them together and all that's going on with this. And I think the audience, most of you will understand because I think most of you probably live in Utah, but the church has a history that is deeply complicated, but it often, as RFM pointed out earlier, treats women in its theology as property. And what we run into is that often the way a woman in Mormonism attains some sort of power or influence is by holding up the patriarchy in the church and supporting it. And what you're pointing to, what happened in the 70s, seems to deeply indicate something very much along those lines. Here's a couple of the quotes that came out during this time. It was like a war, only they had atomic weapons and we had words. The Mormon women, who she estimated had outnumbered non-Mormons by about 10 to 1, could have voted down anything they wanted to, she said. They ran the whole thing. I've never been so rudely treated in my life. Here's another one. Don Lefevre, spokesman for the Mormon Church, acknowledged that the Relief Society had encouraged its members to take part in the convention and vote for correct principles. Right. And so there's this idea that when church leadership says to stand for a thing, as the old quote says, the thinking has been done. And there really isn't room sometimes in Mormonism for us to go, hey, my conscience, my inner voice is telling me something completely different, because it's really not permitted. The moment you do that, you become an outsider in this tribe. And the only way you stay an insider is by doing and being loyal to and being obedient to and following what the church says. So there may be some degree of kind of wanting to stay conversating about Utah on this issue, but these two entities, the state of Utah and the LDS Church, are really tied at the hip on this issue because so much of the population of the state are members of the church. Here's another one. The church, he says, has always been concerned with threats to the stability of the family and the home. How many times on social issues, when changes were needed for us as a society to get healthier, has the church come out in trying to combat that by using, hey, we're going to destroy the family, we're going to destroy the home? He says, we don't make any excuses for our women's participation. We're proud of them. Other women's groups could probably take a note from their book. It just
that really bothered me.
Yeah, please, Maven, say why.
I just wanted to cut it. Well, first of all, because it was obvious, it was done at the behest and the counsel of the men in the church, of course. So to have that in there, like other women's groups could take a note from us, it just blows my mind. But we do have someone in the chat that I just wanted to point out, and I appreciate her being here, but she was part of this. I'm just going to show some of her comments. And so, sorry, I'm going to have to dig through some of them about it. But anyway, I just think it's great that she's here and kind of sharing her experience with this. So I wanted to point that out. And I think it's Donnell, I think is how it's pronounced. I'm sorry if I'm getting that wrong. But yeah, welcome hearing more about this. And let's see, there's another one right here. I just want to show real quick. So yeah, I think it's hard to go in the back and like realize, the ways that you hurt things. So it's very brave. Did you want me to go back at something? Sorry.
The one you just had up before this one.
Yeah, Maven, could you read those out loud,
please,
for the people who will be listening to this on audio only?
Okay, so I'll start over. So the first one that I saw says the women who had organized the conference were gracious, but obviously disheartened by our presence. We voted everything down, sadly. And then the next comment from her is that the church put out a glossy booklet on why the ERA was dangerous. And she says, I always thought the Dallin Oaks was behind that. Is that what you wanted to talk about, Bill?
Just this idea that the church on all of these issues, it did the same thing with Prop 8. It's done the same thing in the past in other ways. It wants to look as though it's not directly involved, but it does pull these strings behind the scenes. And as Kelly was pointing out a few minutes ago, to say you're not going to make any comment. In other words, we're just going to let this thing happen, and we're going to let people, vote and speak out based on their conscience. And then at the last minute to throw a comment in, Mormon leaders know that they will highly persuade their membership when they make such comments. And I just want to note that these quotes all make me really uncomfortable. And as Donnell is pointing out, having been involved personally, maybe on the other side of it at the time. Kelly, Jana,
there's a couple more. Oh, did you want me to read a few more of hers?
Yeah,
just again, for those who will be listening and not watching. So another quote from Donnell was some woman from the Washington State Legislature gave us all signs how to vote on each item presented for a vote. So that's very clear. Like they're being told what to do. And then here's another one. The women who organized the conference, she says, I went to, were appalled that we Mormon women showed up because men told us to. It was pretty disgusting.
Yeah. Kelly, Jen, I want to let you guys jump back in here and your thoughts on some of that messaging that was going on.
To your point, Bill, everything that I had read is that the church itself was pretty silent on this after it was passed in 1972. And it was a last minute thing once this was up for a vote that the church actually spoke out. That polls showed just with a few months before that the clear majority of people, and so it's not just the legislature, the people in Utah were behind the ERA. And when the church put out that statement coming out against it, it immediately went to a clear minority. The support for it just dropped, not just in the legislature, but actually in the population of Utah. And I just think there is this this loyalty to the church that is the thing that gets you praise and accolades and feeling like you're moving toward what you're supposed to be doing, which is moving toward exaltation, right? And so I get the feeling that that was the motivation of a lot of women. I mean, really, it was women, it was conservative Christian women, including Mormons, who doomed the ERA from everything I've read. Yes, it was the leadership of the church who were men who were put this out, but it was the women on the ground who did the damage that brought down support for it.
There's also sort of a sense too that as insurance companies recognize that they would have to insure women as well at the same level as men, that there was a concerted effort, sort of an economic reason, to stop ERA as well. So some of those efforts combined, but certainly I think it's important to talk about that economic piece too, because my sense is our economy here in Utah, as well as within the church itself, does run on the unpaid labor of women. And so when they look at this issue, I think there's really a consideration of, can patriarchy and equal rights for women exist in the same space? And what would that mean for us sort of on a real, and how would that impact our state, right, to actually put that into place? So we can talk about respecting women, but it's still very much in that sense of women on the pedestal. And Utah women are uninterested in the pedestal. We would really like down from there, and would like to work as partners that we are in our relationships. So yeah. I think that the irony there is that there was that great support, and there still is that great support. So a poll in 2020 showed that Mormons, non-Mormons, folks all along that spectrum of spirituality supported the Equal Rights Amendment ratification here in Utah, 71%. And of course, more women. I think that broke down into like 80% women, 60% men. But still 71% of our population here would like to see that happen. And I think that's pretty telling. This came out after the church's announcement. And so what that says to me is that folks really are willing to look at this issue and say, based on my conscience, based on what I understand, I'm not really willing to accept some of those fearful excuses of the past that really came about in the 1970s, like that it was going to ruin the family, like that it would bring about gay marriage, like that it would cause women to serve in the armed forces. Women serve in every arm of the armed forces now. And what they don't have is protection against assault. What they don't have is a clear ladder to climb. So, and what we don't have here in Utah is women being able to make meaningful decisions. So we've been given some kind of crumbs, as Jana kind of described. We're given small things that really don't equate to real power. And so I guess the question that I constantly ask myself is, what will it take for that power sharing to take place? And I think it's really going to involve more men being willing to speak up, to stand up in support, to be as concerned about this issue as women.
Yeah.
There's an irony there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's so often thought of as being a woman's issue. And the reality is the Equal Rights Amendment will help men. Yeah. It really is an equalization effort that will benefit families. So as long as women are being shortchanged on their paycheck, as long as they are being shortchanged in their decision making, only allowed to really lead women and and children, not really able to make clear decisions in the religion, some of those pieces, they have to come about. And I think there is a reckoning happening, and I think there must be a reckoning take place.
Yeah. I want to, please.
I have a question for Kelly. Just for people who are out there wondering, like, why do we still need this? We have so many of the protections, in laws. We have, depending on how you read the 14th Amendment, that may or may not be a protection. But for those who are wondering why is this still important today? And second, how does it benefit men?
Okay.
I'm
Yeah.
curious what your thoughts are on that.
Absolutely. Remind me of your first question. Sorry, I'm already focused on the second one. What was the first question?
Well, you can start with the second one. Why is it still necessary today?
Oh, absolutely. So we have amazing laws that have grown up in the place of the Equal Rights Amendment. So you will have many say to you, even here in Utah, well, we have it in our state constitution. We have these laws that have grown up in that place. Isn't that enough? And yet we're seeing the laws that have been hard won by women be walked back and watered down in terms of employment, sex discrimination at work. Those laws are in place, but they've been walked back. And so the realization that constitutional protection is different, it adds an increased layer of protections there for women. It gives us standing in our own constitution that we have never had. It mostly will impact women in the courts. So right now we use a lower level of scrutiny when these cases come to court called intermediate scrutiny. And it means that not only do I have to prove that I was discriminated against, but I've got to also prove that there was an intent to discriminate, which is a much higher legal standard that you would have to climb. Right. So in the courts, that's where we will really see this difference, where women will more often find justice. But we'll also, anytime there's federal legislation, it will have to pass through a filter of the Equal Rights Amendment to ensure equal access and opportunity, and also equity, which is balancing of sort of the historical discrimination that women have faced. So it's those two pieces that will really make a difference for women and why we still must have it.
You did a great job of answering that one part of the question. Now to the second part, Kelly.
Yeah.
What's in it for me?
What's in it for you?
Yeah.
Well, I think when we talk about the family, we're always talking about the need for both parents to be involved. And that's one area of law that still kind of lags behind others. So for instance, in alimony situations, where it's important for men and women to be part of their children's lives and to be active participants and working with children in an equal way. Sometimes we have in different states, we have pieces of that aren't completely equal. So that would be one way that men would be impacted by the Equal Rights Amendment. Another way is honestly through the draft. So that's one of the big carryovers from the 1970s was this idea that women could be drafted. I mean, it's kind of a ridiculous discussion because we just we have a voluntary army, we wage wars in different ways. So it's kind of a ridiculous suggestion. And in fact, in 2019, a Texas court ruled that the draft itself was unconstitutional because it only required men to serve, and they won that case, and the service is actually looking at including women in an equal way if there were to be a draft again. And in fact, women have been able to be drafted all along. We just haven't done it based on kind of convention reasons. But men were able to use their standing in the Constitution in that court case, something that we as women could not do because we do not currently have standing in our Constitution.
Yeah. Yeah.
go ahead, Bill.
Well, I want to build a bridge here between talking about the history and then moving kind of into where we're at now, where we're kind of talking about the present stuff. And I don't want this to not get to not be part of tonight's show. So I'm going to add it to the stream right now, and I'm going to remove that comment just so we can see Jana. I'm sorry, Jana, the way StreamYard works, you're at the bottom and you keep getting blocked out, but
guys are at the top.
Yeah. Look at that. Yeah. We've got to do something about that, RFM. So,
hey, Bill, can I give a lead into this?
Please explain what's going on here before this soundbite plays.
This is my huge contribution to tonight's show, so I'm really excited about it. So anyway, no, my understanding is, first off, I did want to make the comment that did occur to me while you were speaking, that this is right in the time in the 1970s when the phrase, when the prophet speaks, the thinking has been done or the debate is over, gained a lot of currency in the LDS Church. And it became very famous because in Eldon Tanner, the first counselor in the first presidency, said that in a first presidency message in the August 1979 Ensign. And the really interesting thing about it is that he didn't say this on his own. He's actually quoting somebody else from 1978. I'll bet you know who he's quoting. He's quoting a woman. So this is how it starts. These are the very first two sentences. Recently, at the church, this is from the 1978 First Presidency message. Recently, at the church-wide fireside meeting held for the women of the church, Young Women President Elaine Cannon made the following statement, quote, "When the prophet speaks, the debate is over." So he's quoting a woman approvingly in this concept. And it seems that maybe the timing of this is more than just coincidental. So anyway, that was sort of thrown out there for anybody's ideas. But it's also my understanding that at the same time that the church is making a statement that this is how we feel about the ERA, this is our position on the ERA, and it's against the ERA, that they're also saying through other people like Lefebvre, the spokesperson for the church, that the church really wants the members of the church to study the issue on their own and come to their own decision and vote their conscience according to correct principles, right?
Absolutely.
It's sort of this double messaging. They have the benefit of knowing that all the members of the church, the good members of the church, are going to take their marching orders from the prophet. And if he's against something, then they'll all be against it. Meanwhile, they can say through this other mouthpiece that they want everybody to study the issues and vote their conscience when they know perfectly well what Mormons are going to do. They're going to follow the prophet, and the prophet becomes the substitute for their conscience and the substitute for their study. So the thing that really fascinated me is that at the same time as that church leaders are presenting this message that they want their members to follow correct principles, study it out on their own, vote their conscience, give them that at least public claim of freedom of choice, agency, that kind of thing. Behind the scenes, what's actually going on is that church is using agents of the church in the security division of the church to go out to ERA gatherings and rallies and find people who are attending them, write down their license plate numbers, run them through the Salt Lake Police Department so they can find out who the registered owner and address is of these vehicles, and then ship that information off to the respective stake presidents for appropriate action. And no, I'm not making this up. I actually remembered this. I'm always excited when I remember something. You'll find out how that is when you get to be my age. But this is from 2014. And Brent Metcalf, very noted scholar in Mormon studies, was being interviewed on Mormon Stories by John DeLynn. And he told this story. This is his personal experience because he was working for church security at the time from late 1979 to around 1983. And he was in the operations center at the church office building. He wasn't one of the guys going out and getting the license plate numbers. He was the one who was having those license plate numbers radioed back into him. And then he and perhaps others in the control center would then call the Salt Lake Police Department and get the information about the registered owners. And then it would go up to the director. And then it was their understanding that that information was gathered to be sent out to the state presidents. And I went back and I got this clip.
Yeah.
And it's 2.5 minutes long. And this is Brent Metcalf's talking from personal experience.
Yeah. And I'll play this. And I think it's important because after this clip, we'll move into the present moment and we'll talk about where things are at and what's affected in the here and now. And I think that really is the important part of the conversation for us to be able to do something and to help progress. But I think this is important because if believing Mormons understand the degree to which the church goes to stop things and to prevent things, in spite of the fact that, you know, decades later, it slowly moves in line with that same progress, although again, behind, it helps us to better sense that we can't just sit idly by and just assume the church is all good and it's going to always do what's best for the human beings that are a part of it. And so here's that clip.
I can't hear that, Bill.
dispatch unit
Here,
for the church
sorry.
security guards. Before is when I worked in the security controls center, which was essentially the dispatch unit for the church security guards. I remember that there were a number of ERA meetings being held in Utah at the time. And on one particular occasion when a rally had been held, and I think it was up at the Capitol, and then the folks who had attended that had receded to another location where they were going to, kind of hold their own private meeting. And I remember getting calls in from certain security guards who were out in the field who were giving me license plate numbers. And what we were told to do, which I even found extraordinarily troubling at the time as, a faithful Latter-day Saint, was that we were to call the numbers into the police department and find out the owners of these vehicles. And then we got that information from the police department, and in turn, that was turned over to the upper echelons of the church security department, who then forwarded that information on to the respective stake presidents who oversaw the owners of these vehicles. And so basically that was a very strange interplay between, the police department and the security department. And I don't put any fault on the police department, because we would call in all the time with license plate numbers of vehicles that were improperly parked around Temple Square or around the church office building. And they would give us the appropriate information so the owners could be contacted and asked to take care of the parking situation or whatever the vehicle.
So they didn't know why you were calling?
No.
Okay.
No. We didn't say, these people are attending an ERA meeting.
Yeah.
Right. We would just call them and say, hi, this is so-and-so. We had a direct line to them, and we would call and say, hi, this is so-and-so from the church security department. We've got a license plate number that we need the information on, and they would provide it.
Your thoughts about that, Kelly and Jana?
It's shocking, but I think we have to understand the level of fear that was happening there. There was a real sense that authority was being thwarted. I mean, you think of it, we were coming out of the civil rights era. There was a real, with Watergate and everything that was happening during that time period, the idea then that women would in some ways be abandoning their traditional roles was really a fearful thing for them. And so they did go to drastic measures. Even Carolyn Pearson at that time came and spoke out in support of the Equal Rights Amendment, and her ability to publish was withheld for an entire year in church magazines and publications. So when you see the level that folks will go to, and then obviously women were removed from their spiritual homes, right? So Sonia Johnson was excommunicated. She had some really spectacular run-ins with Orrin Hatch in Congress as she testified. But because of her support, I mean, this is someone who was so involved in her church membership. She played the organ in her church the Sunday before she was excommunicated the next day on a Monday. So she absolutely was committed and dedicated to her religion and was removed. And down the line, Maxine Hanks, right? Similar situation where she spoke up, she presented a paper, much like Sonia had done. And that was enough, that willingness to be public with her concerns and her desires for betterment of the church and betterment for women in the church resulted in them being really violently removed from the place where they had really invested their spiritual energies. And more recently, Kate Kelly, right? Her work with ordained women is probably the most profound effort that we've had in the last decade. And for her efforts of bringing, really just asking that question on a really fundamental level, what would greater involvement of women look like within the religion? she also lost her spiritual home. So when we look at these situations, I think it's devastating, because I'll tell you, based on my heritage, my upbringing, the sense of fairness that I learned within the religion, the desire to recognize individual worth that we all carry with us. Those are some things that inform my support of the Equal Rights Amendment. That sense of fairness and that desire to treat people kindly and treat them as I would want to be treated really does grow from my upbringing in the religion. And so to see some stand so prominently against it is really devastating.
Yeah. Individual worth, isn't that a young woman's value?
It absolutely is.
I thought I recognized it.
Right.
I wanted to jump into kind of the present moment, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about, because one of the things you brought up that we wanted to insert into the outline is some of the ways in which things not being equal affect people in the here and now. And two of the things you mentioned were domestic violence and campus violence. And I'm curious if you can maybe lay out for the audience so they can make some connections to how not having equality brings more risk to these two facets.
Absolutely. I would say two things, purity culture and perfectionism, the two P's that I think, and then I would also add another one, politeness, right? So we are taught so often as women to be demure, like you just described, to be subordinate. We're really trained in those ways. When I look back at my time in Young Women's, I don't think I was asked, what would you like to be in? What career would you like to go into? It was always assumed that that motherhood would be my career. And so I think in our training of women, we really don't prepare them well to protect themselves. So we trust them to rely on things outside of themselves. So rely on others, as opposed to really listening to their own internal thoughts and feelings and learning to trust their gut. You know, we as women are good. We the feelings and ideas that we have within us are worthy and good, and we need to be teaching our young women to trust those instincts. And when we have such a profound focus on perfectionism, on checking boxes, on purity culture, which really draws focus then as to, it really makes women sexual objects, as opposed to what I think its intention was to really raise respect for women. It has that opposite effect of really drawing attention and teaching women to police their bodies and to police the bodies of other women, and really turning women into sexual objects. I think as we can pull away from those ideas, those harmful ideas, we really will arm our women with the ability to advocate for themselves, to speak for themselves, to act for themselves, and not to defer to someone else or the ideas of someone else. So that strikes me in terms of domestic violence. We have a higher than the national average rate of domestic violence in our state. Yeah. It's 1 in 3 versus 1 in 4. And campus violence, we're seeing that be a major factor as well. So we have to, I think, rethink the way that we are training our young women and our young men.
Now, usually when Maven's box appears, it's because she has something that she wants to add. Is that the case?
Yes, that is. Thank you, Bill. I just wanted to speak to what you were just saying, because I have friends who I think, ironically, because of the teachings of the church, were assaulted or allowed more things to happen to them in their bodies than they personally wanted to do, because of that responsibility that they already felt for where things were going. Like they were blamed for the reactions that the men they were with were having. And so I think and my messaging was the same. It's very disempowering, even though they're trying to make us the arbiters of sexual purity, both for ourselves and the men. Actually, that blame, and I have two friends specifically that I'm thinking of that, you know, when things started to go awry, were already blaming themselves from the very beginning. And I guess were unable to even say no for themselves or express their own opinions about what was happening to them, and, you know, just let the guys do, what they wanted. And they blamed themselves. And one of them even went to her bishop to basically confess about something that happened to her that I would say was not consensual, but she didn't have, it really takes away our voice and our ability to actually say no for ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful point, Maven. I couldn't have said it better. That's incredible. I'm often thinking about how Mormonism calls you when you have something inside your inner authority says something, and that inner authority runs counter to the system's message. You're often you feel pressured to defer that to the outside authority, and you can sense in a million situations when young kids go in for leadership interviews, when a young woman takes a young man, say, back to her dorm or to his dorm, and she's taught to trust the priesthood as from God, and to question her own conscience and authority when voices come up within. You can see a million scenarios where it can go south, and it sometimes does. And it feels as though the most vulnerable among us are the ones who are at risk, both male and female. And I'm precisely thinking of children. And we've got to get better at teaching human beings to trust their inner voice. Because I think when people feel that encouragement to do that, I think generally better things happen. Thoughts from you two on that?
I mean, absolutely. I'm a huge proponent in helping people learn to trust their inner voices. But something that just keeps rolling through my head is something that it was a kind of a rhetorical question, maybe not so rhetorical, that Kelly threw out, which is, can you have patriarchy and equality in the same place, and gender equality in the same place? And I think it's a really important question that the church and the church leaders have to ask themselves, because I read a lot about what the church said about the ERA and about gender equality, and I think on some level they genuinely are saying, yeah, we think women should be equal. Yeah, that absolutely should be. And at the same time, I think the theology around a nuclear family, which is already in the minority of families, even within the church, and going down all the time, the percentage of people who fall within that ideal. And yet it's such a protection of that particular model that we have not been willing to speak out to what is happening outside of that and what is actually meant by it. I mean, I went back and read some of this Ensign article in 1977 that came out that Boyd K. Packer wrote. And it doesn't age well, I would just tell you that. But, a couple of quotes from it. There are basic things that a man needs that a woman does not need. There are things that a man feels that a woman never does feel. There are basic things that a woman needs that a man never needs. There are things that a woman feels that a man never feels, nor should he. These differences make women in basic needs literally opposite from men. One other thing, he says, many thoughtful wives haven't the slightest desire to be reduced to equality with their husbands. There's that pedestalization right there. But I think that so much of this has to do with this grip that we have on patriarchy, which I don't know how the church extricates itself from that. I think there are ways, but they're pretty drastic, and I don't see any appetite for it. And so I think the church is in a quandary, trying to, I think they speak to personal revelation and make your own decisions and study things out and vote your conscience. And yet they do speak out on political things, but not when they're political, it's when they're moral. And so if you're telling a good believing church-going person that it's a moral thing, and we're going to tell you what the moral thing is, what room does anyone have to disagree? So it's a huge pickle. And I don't think anyone that I've seen at the tops of the church level, they're not willing to dig deeply into this. and to explain exactly how they think we're supposed to do all of these things. How are we supposed to follow our instincts? How are we supposed to work within what all families need, and single women need, and single men need, and people who don't fit the norm? We just keep harping on this ideal that causes all kinds of problems for us. And these are the kinds of opinions that, I mean, like you said, Kelly, they're saying, well, we haven't looked at it in 40 years. I'm thinking, if this is the reasoning, can we at least look at psychological studies over the last 40 years to say that, all of this, where our needs are so completely different, is just not bearing out? And what do we do with that? If that was the basis of why we were making these decisions, then we really need to rethink this.
Yeah, I'm just glad that Boyd K. Packer didn't mention little factories in that. I was expecting it at any moment.
I want to get that quote. And I was trying to find something that I had come across and researching for or reading stuff about today's, but there was someone, when you were talking about, some women, or I guess the part of the quote you were saying, wouldn't want to be reduced to equality. There was a woman who was talking about it and about how, about this false exalted status. And I just remember I loved the quote because she said, if it's so exalted, then, we'd love to see what man would be happy to change his sex and be as exalted as we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing, we've got to be honest about women's contribution. I so often, when I'm talking with legislators about the bills that we are working to run, they'll say to me something like, well, my wife feels equal. And we've got to really push back on that. We've got to recognize, many of them likely wouldn't be able to do what they do up there on the Hill without having someone, a partner or a spouse, taking care of everything else. And so I do think, and I think that's a message for all of us, whether wherever we fall along the religious spectrum, to ask ourselves, are we benefiting from the unpaid labor of women? Am I acknowledging the contributions of women? Are we being honest about the ways that women have helped to build our society, our church, our communities? And I think we all, when I talk about a reckoning, it's not just for religious circles, really, it's for secular circles as well. What are we benefiting, or are we working for greater equality?
Yeah. I want to ask you a couple more questions, and then I'm hoping maybe you guys are up for taking a phone call or two from viewers. There's a note in here about power of constitutional protections versus law. You were talking about this earlier, Kelly, where the burden of proof in some of these incidents is much higher than maybe what is healthy. Would you mind commenting any further you want to say about that regard of power of constitutional protections versus the law itself?
Absolutely. So we know that laws can be walked back and changed. There's a famous case, Walmart versus Dukes, where they found discrimination in women's management, the amount of money that they were being paid. And they were able to find it at Walmart in 350 stores. But what that case decided is it pushed it back so that each woman in each of those stores had to try to litigate it individually. They did, and the cases from then on required that individual litigation. So the laws that were meant to protect women in the workplace have now been kind of walked back, and that can't happen with that constitutional protection, that filter in place. The other piece, I think Jana mentioned, the 14th Amendment, which does have an equality clause, right? Equal protection clause, which is often used as a stopgap measure for these cases, but really inconsistently. So sometimes it will be applied, sometimes not. And even, one of the most conservative justices, Justice Scalia, basically said, a lot of people think the 14th protects against sex discrimination. It doesn't. So we have these pieces in place, but if you look at even the issue of, for instance, race, we have the Civil Rights Act, right? We have laws in place that are meant to protect in those ways. And even with those pieces in place, we still have not sort of reached that level of equality there, right? So when we think about women's issues, again, we need all of the things. We need the laws to help protect. I don't think women could have their own bank account until 1978. That's within my lifetime. And I think, some folks are shocked to think about the fact that those barriers existed. And the Equal Rights Amendment would not only sort of balance the scales in terms of equal opportunity and access, but it would also say, we didn't start from the same place, and we need to acknowledge that because certain pieces impact women on a greater scale.
Yeah, when I was working in Ohio, when I first got a job with the floor covering store that I worked for there, and I worked there for 16 years, very early on, I'm in my early 20s, and my boss comes up to me and he goes, "Hey, Bill, we're giving you a raise. This is what we're going to pay you. But don't say anything." And it was the female employee who had been there 6 years longer than me and a hell of a good employee. And he said, don't say anything to her because we're not paying her as much because you're the husband of your home. You're the father of your home. So we're paying you more. And so people have it in their heads that this stuff still doesn't go on, that we're past that, right? Like we're now paying people based on the merit of their work. And the reality is all across the country, not just in Utah, we're still doing things in unhealthy ways. And there needs to be something. I don't know exactly how we do it or what it says or how we word it, but there needs to be something in place that stops that sort of behavior where an exemplary employee who has more seniority and is making the company as much or more money is making less income because of her gender.
Absolutely. It's like pay transparency is so important. That's something that we believe would be heavily impacted because even in 2022, we are still having issues of pregnancy discrimination here in our state. So it oftentimes is the case where because the barriers to actually gaining justice are so difficult, women are dissuaded from taking things to court. So it's not that these injustices aren't happening. It's just that they are not maybe being taken to the full extent to actually receive justice because they often don't, right? So women can invest all of this money, all of this effort in and still come out the loser at the end. Yeah. So we all lose if we think about it, because when a man and a woman are paid equally, they can equally support their families. And there's this kind of mirage about kind of this traditional family that really doesn't exist anymore. Like we really, it doesn't exist in the way that it might have existed in the 1950s, even still in the 1970s. This is really a different time. And Utah women actually work more than women across the nation at higher rates. But oftentimes it's part-time work, which means that they don't get benefits, they don't get a living wage, they don't have the same advancement opportunities. And really they leave work and then head home to work that second shift. And so they don't have the same opportunities even still, even though the economic landscape is so radically different.
Can I take 60 seconds to float an idea and get your response, Jana and Kelly? I have gone back and I've looked at this issue. I've done some research. I don't pretend to know it as well as either of you. But I've also recently looked back and researched the church's position relating to gay marriage and the different permutations of that and the different fights and battles that have occurred over the course of time, most of them led by President Oaks. But taking all that into account, it strikes me that the arguments that the church used and maybe continues to use against the ERA are largely picked up from other sources. They're just sort of legal arguments, or this is what could happen. And they are not religious arguments, if you know what I mean. They're secular arguments like the draft or unisex bathrooms or gay marriage will happen if the ERA gets passed. Well, I think that boat has sailed. However, I think it's possible, because I've seen it happen before, that the church's reasons that are expressed for opposing the ERA may not actually be the real fundamental reason that they're opposing the ERA. And I think, and I'm speculating here, that one of the real fundamental reasons that the church opposes the ERA is because there is no religious exemption. in it. And I bring this up because this is something that Elder Oaks always focused on. Any new legislation relating to gay marriage or gay rights, he always wants there to be a religious exemption in it before they will support it, so that the church is exempt from it. And it strikes me that if the ERA were passed the way it's written, there's no religious exemption, and it could set them up for a conflict between the Equal Rights Amendment and the First Amendment related to establishment of religion. And now you've got a battlefield set where I think their fear could be that the church could be forced legally to put women in positions of leadership, and God forbid, give them the priesthood. Your thoughts on that? Do you think I'm onto something? Have you thought about this before?
Absolutely. Like, I think you're onto something. Jana, do you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes from a very fundamental view of how the world should be. And everything stems from that. And so if they hear, if you've got this as your worldview, and this is the way the world should be, and I think they'd see themselves in a very paternalistic way, being the ones that have to show the church membership how to do it right? Then you're going to grab onto anything that buoys up your argument. So all of that, everything I've read is, the church does try to tie it back to the theology, in that, this is really not the role of women. This is not what God meant for women. They bring it back in that way. But I absolutely agree with you that I think that would scare the crap out of the church to not have an exemption, because within their own employment, there would be repercussions.
Right. I have a good friend who worked for the church and had to wear a dress to work every day. So I mean, that's a change that happened just in the last few years, where that requirement was relaxed. So there's certainly some practices that would have to change in corporate life, in community life, and in religious life as well. And I'm sad to say that, honestly, the only word we've really had since they came out with that headline and finally did give comment was really the editorial board at the Deseret News put out that article the day before we announced in 2018 with Representative Karen Kwan, and it really was it was written by a woman lawyer, which is kind of a pattern of having women kind of speak some of the things that maybe are harder to hear. But it had a lot of bigoted ideas around transgender women. And that was really concerning to me. It spoke a legal perspective, but again, it was one that was really, you could tell, frightened of the idea that the Equal Rights Amendment might be more inclusive. And I have every hope that it will be. I do know that courts like to look at things in a pretty narrow way. So it's likely that they will look at when the Equal Rights Amendment was written, which was right after women won the vote, 1923. So they'll look at it, what did the meaning of sex mean in 1923? They'll look at what it meant in 1972 when it passed, and then they'll look at it now currently. And we've seen some pretty dramatic shifts in our understanding of that word just in the last 2 or 3 years. So we've made some terrific gains in the LGBTQIA+ community, and I'm encouraged to see that at least a third of that will be taken into account as the courts look and see the scope of the Equal Rights Amendment. We cannot be excluding. We need to learn our lessons of the past and recognize that when we exclude, we do terrible damage, right? And the women of suffrage had to learn that as they excluded women of color. We've certainly learned that through some of the battles with our queer community in the last few years. We just cannot continue to exclude. And I don't believe that equality will be stopped. I think it is a progressive movement that will continue. You're seeing young women leave the church in really radical numbers. I think that alone should raise the alarm. And you've seen these polls come out where the church is trying to kind of understand why they're leaving. This is part of why they're leaving. They're leaving because they don't feel that they have real import and real meaningful connection in their religion. And those are things that can be fixed, but there has to be a will, like Jana said, for that to happen.
Yeah, it seems as though, again, Jana asked if maybe it was rhetorical, but the idea that patriarchy and equal rights, they might be antithetical, number one. Number two is, Jana, you mentioned that, some people don't fit in a box. And my 2 cents is that there's a facet of every one of us human beings that don't fit in a box. And we can't help but be the humanity that we are, right? We're doing the best we can and showing up as ourself in this moment. And so hopefully people were nudged a little bit tonight as they're thinking about this issue too. Number three, the church obviously knows it's losing women, and it knows it can't afford to do that. It knows if it loses its youth, as it said on its own, it's one generation away from not existing, right? And recently it removed a ton of its sexism from its temple rituals. And I wouldn't say all sexism is gone, but a chunk of it was removed. And that to me points definitively that these men of older age seem to be catching on that doing things as the status quo isn't working. And so you just saw recently where I think about 6 of the top leaders went out and all gave talks on the same night to the youth. There is some sense of fear, but we're not there yet. As you guys point out, there's a lot of work to do. And so my last question for you guys, RFM may have another one when I'm done, but what if somebody was nudged tonight in the listenership, if somebody's nudged tomorrow listening to the audio, where can they go? What can they do? How can they help? Like, what can others do in banding together in your cause? How can we nudge the needle a little bit?
Yeah, I have some real thoughts on that.
Please.
So you can come and join in with us. We have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter accounts. The Instagram and Twitter at ERA Utah is a great place to learn about the events that are taking place. February 13th will be our ERA Day at the Capitol from 1 to 3. We'll have swag. We'll have information. We have a one sheet that really defines some of these arguments, I think, in a profound way, but also in a way that a conservative portion of our citizenry can really relate to, because the Equal Rights Amendment will not get passed here in Utah without bringing others along. So I know there are many who are kind of on the fence on this, and I would encourage those who have thought about it and considered it to really dive in and say, I'm going to stand up. Again, I've mentioned that statistic of 80% of Utah women want this, 60% of Utah men. So I really would like to see men standing up and speaking out more earnestly for these rights. It's ironic to me that women are expected to solve the issue of women's rights. I think that we didn't cause this problem. We may have had import here and there, but we need more folks on board. And so please start having some of those conversations. Talk it over with those that you care about. Invite and learn about more information. You can go to our webpage, www.utaheracoalition.org, and learn more under resources. Come join in and find and advocate for women. But even if you're not going to rise to that level, look around and see within your own sphere of influence how you can help to elevate the voices of women and start to recognize the ways that we all contribute to those inequities.
Yeah, I'm sad to say that in my early 20s, when that incident happened at my employment, I didn't do anything. And that wouldn't happen today. And so I think each of us, as we gain experience and go through more things in life, we realize that there are other human beings who don't get the same opportunities we get, don't get the same protections. And it's my hope that a few of you watching and listening, that you'll be moved enough, because I think every one of us should find a good cause and contribute to helping move the needle towards a better world. And it's my hope that maybe 3 or 4 or 5 people at least watching right now, and maybe a few dozen that listen over the next couple of weeks, that they'll do something and help make this in this facet of where we live and this issue, make things a little better. So I thank you guys a lot.
Can I say one thing, Bill?
Please, Jana.
Just as someone who literally probably 10 years ago was still saying, I feel equal in the church. I don't see what the issue is. I was one of those. I would just say that if you are one of those, or if you're one of those that some of these changes feel like it's going to be threatening to the traditional family or threatening to your values, I would just put out a challenge to maybe just listen to people's stories. They're out there. Listen to podcasts of people whose personal lives have been affected, and just see if you can open up your eyes to see, or just your heart to say, I wonder if there is more that other people are seeing than what I have experienced in my life. I wonder why other people are concerned and why we need this. Because once you start really listening to other people and understanding how their lives are affected, it opens up your mind to think in different ways. And then you start asking questions like, is this the beginning of the end for our moral fabric of our society? What has happened in Europe where, there are 10 countries there that have, an ERA equivalent in their constitutions, or, in their governing documents, and what has happened there for them. And just start questioning the status quo, because it was something that I never did. I never questioned. I just heard, oh, that's a dangerous thing, so it must be, rather than really looking into it and saying, a lot of the things we feared in the 70s have happened in other ways without the ERA. And I don't know, my life still seems like it's going on track. So I don't know. I would just a plea to anyone else who still feels fearful about this to do more questioning. Just question and do some research.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If you guys don't mind, we'll take a couple of phone calls. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, let's do it.
Do you have any other comments before we do that?
I just was going to mention, because Jana talked about this idea of feeling equal. I hear that so often, and I really do think that it wasn't until ordained women that women in the church started to really question and ask themselves. They may never have been socialized to even ask, what would greater involvement look like, right? We're busy doing a lot of volunteer work in religious circles and in our communities. That keeps us really pretty busy. Many of us work, right? But what else? What else is there? And what might that look like? I think understanding our history and our past, where we've come from, even like Emma Smith, reading a little bit more about her work and as a bookkeeper essentially for the church, right? Understanding that she kept the books, she kept track of the property that they owned. Like a lot of that property was in her name because she was really keeping track of the economics of the church. That's a fact that I didn't know after spending 40 plus years in the religion. So we need to do a better job of understanding the contributions that women have made over time and elevating those efforts, right? And we can do that sort of historically, but we must also do that now, right? Women's work is expanding beyond kind of what we had thought of it traditionally, and we need to acknowledge and respect that. Just a quick quote too from Kate Kelly, who I really credit with pushing that question out in our modern life. She said, women can feel respected and validated in the church, but equality can be measured. Equality is not a feeling. And I really appreciate that. And I would add to that, equality is a metric. It can be measured. And we need to all be kind of taking out our yardstick and kind of measuring how we're responding to that call in our own lives.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a couple of calls here. So the first one I'm going to bring on is Mary. Mary wants to talk about her experience on this topic. And so, Mary, you're on Mormonism Live with Radio Free Mormon Bill Reel, Kelly Whited Jones, and Jana Spangler. What's your thoughts tonight?
Gentlemen and ladies, how are you all doing this evening?
Good. Is that really quiet for you guys?
I want to tell you that.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I must tell you, it is gorgeous here in New Orleans. In case you guys are freezing. In the early 1920s, my mother told us a story about, once again, her father coming home with lipstick on his collar, and my grandmother flipped, apparently, and packed up her things and packed up my mom's things, and they walked out the door and with their little suitcases and headed down to Grand Central Station to catch a train. And when they got to Grand Central Station, my grandmother sat down, took my mom in her arms, and cried because they had no place to go. She had no money. Nobody had any money. And so they turned around and went back. So you have to understand, I've been raised in a fiercely matriarchal home since that time. The things I've been through in my life have been, some of them have been pretty freaking shocking, that I've run into in the workplace. I'm a professional. I'm an engineer. Very rare for a woman to be an engineer. And I used to think these guys would just die off, but I hate to tell you, ladies, they just breed up more like them. So if you are taking, if being in the church means you have to take orders from other people, get out. If you can't make any progress in Utah, get out. Don't beat your head against brick walls, because I spent many years doing it, and I'm even older than RFM, which I know is shocking. Not much older, but I am older than RFM. Please don't beat a dead horse.
Thanks, Mary.
Mary, thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable. I appreciate you sharing your experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's tough, and she talks about this idea of like a lot of women feel equal because they kind of fit that traditional role, that traditional model. But when a spouse dies or when divorce happens, and suddenly they're in plan B and they're trying to figure out how to make it work, suddenly the inequities that women have faced all along can be very, very glaring. So, and the support isn't always there, right? My mom was divorced when I was 12 and did not find support. She was encouraged to stay in a pretty emotionally abusive relationship by church leaders, right? Asked to stay in it. And that's just not healthy. It's not good. So I appreciate her being willing to share the trials that she's been through, and really that experience of the plan B, of having to grapple with the economy of being a single parent. Tough.
Jana, what do you think about Mary's exhortation to you to get out of Utah?
If only it were that easy. Yeah, I mean, I can totally sympathize with her feeling that way, right? And the reality is it isn't that easy for a lot of people, and we do have to kind of stay and make do with what we have.
Yeah.
So it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem because I can totally sympathize with this idea that the church can never be healthy for women and for LGBT people, for a whole swath of people. And I think if you give all of your authority to it, it 100% is true. And it's extremely hard not to when you have been born into it. And I also think that, yeah, Utah can be really, really challenging politically. It drives me absolutely crazy at times, our legislature. And in both instances, it's the same thing. It's people in power who think they know better than everybody else. And I think that is just inherently damaging. If you're going to be in power and you're not going to listen to people, you are going to do damage.
Yeah. I know, and I'm struck by this dichotomy. Where else in the United States, maybe there is a place where you have such overwhelming poll numbers among men and women in favor of a proposition that does not get reflected in the votes of the legislature who are supposed to represent them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it happens wherever you have a supermajority. But it happens continually in Utah all the time. There are things that are passed that then the legislature takes into a special session and totally cuts down, that were things that were passed by the people. So it happens all the time. The legislature thinks they know better than we do. They make me crazy.
And I would tell Mary that we are in the exact right place where we need to be making change. So we absolutely are needed here in this environment. And I would say to all the listeners out there, your voice is needed, right? As we join together, I see great potential for our state and for us to be able to affect change. It's going to take time. It's going to take time and we have to stay with it. But I'm so grateful for the women that came before me who were willing to forge those new trails, continue to push and continue to fight, because whether the Equal Rights Amendment is passed here in Utah or not, there's a good chance that the efforts that we make here will be matched on the national level, and that will help to push that effort forward. So that could be a real legitimate way for Utah to have the Equal Rights Amendment, is through that consistent pressure here in our state, a red state. We continue to work for greater equality here because it matters to the national conversation.
Yeah. And I just want to note, if the church continues to block healthy improvements, what it does is it gets smaller and smaller. And as we already see by Salt Lake County, the majority of people there aren't active Mormons anymore, right? And I think the majority are no longer even labeling themselves as Mormons. And so we're getting to the point where Utah is going to become less than 50% Mormon, both by people moving in as well as people leaving the church. And what you don't want to do is have a state full of people who aren't on your side, who see you as having acted unhealthy and motivated by unhealthy reasons, that you've carried forth things that have really caused trauma to people. And those kinds of things will stick in the collective memory. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next decade or two or three. And Mary makes a valid point. I think if people want to get out and leave, they certainly can. But also, just like her story she led off with, sometimes you don't get on the train, you turn around and you find a way to make a difference at home. Yep. And so that's possible too.
And I think it's important for each person to know what is right for them, right? For some people, it is absolutely the right thing for them to get out. And for some people, it is absolutely the right thing to stay in. And I appreciate, Kelly, and your optimism. I have to remember it from time to time. There's still hope.
Well, my hope is that we have more and more women, and I would say reasonable women. It can't just be women, because we found that there have been women in the legislature who've been willing to block this effort. So it needs to be reasonable women in office. That is a metric that we still fall very short on. Run for office, run for your local school board, run for your city council, work your way up to where you could be potentially helping to draft these policies and laws that can affect change here in our state. That's a very, very real piece. And I would love to see more women in leadership positions. That's something tangible that we can do.
Love it. Let's take one more call. We've got Marco on the phone. Marco, you are on Mormonism Live. We're talking about equal rights. What's on your mind tonight, my friend?
Yeah, thank you for taking my call. For the guests, just a quick question, if you could quickly answer. Were your mothers the type of women that fit that traditional role that the church really likes to push?
It's a yes for me. Yes, I had a stay-at-home mother who very much fit the mold.
Yes, my mom was the mother
now for
of
the host.
8.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, and now for the host, RFM Bill, did you have mothers that fit that mold?
Yes.
No, my mom was a nurse's aide. When I was 12 years old, she went back to school, became an LPN, continued her education, getting a specialization in wound care. And up until about a week before she passed away from cancer a couple of years ago, she was always working. Her and my dad both worked full-time jobs and took damn good care of us, me and my brother. And my mom didn't put up with the BS of anybody. If anybody tried to push her around, she simply didn't tolerate it. And I think it's her that I get some of my justice warrior passion from.
Yeah.
And so, no, I might be the anomaly here. I had a very strong mother.
You know what, Bill?
Yeah.
You and I are part of you and I, Bill, are part of a specific special group then, because I can honestly say I was the 4th child out of 6. And long before I was born, my mom was working as a nurse. And when I was in high school, same thing. She went back to school, got her master's degree from the University of Utah. And my dad was working too. Both parents worked full time. Honestly, I thought that was the norm. And once I got into high school, a lot of my peers would say very weird things about, like, get back in the kitchen, ha ha ha. You know, really, really. I mean, I just laugh along because I'm a kid. I don't know what's going on. But, you know, looking back, it's like, wow, that's kind of messed up. And just kind of thinking about how rigid Mormonism is when it comes to those gender roles. And here I am. I feel like a fish out of water when I married my now ex-wife. She was like, I'm staying home once we have kids. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm still going to school and things like that. And I can't fathom how some men, not to make this about men, but like how men take on such a responsibility to both work and go to school or just other things. And also the stress on the moms that they stay at home. They're worried about the money too. Anyways, I just think it's fascinating. Just the whole thing about women's rights. I'm like, it's 2022 and we're still not passing an equal rights amendment. It's just, things have to change.
Yeah. Amen. Thank you, Marco.
I should qualify that too, and just let you know that my mom did that until she divorced my dad, like I said, when I was 12. And at that point really did have to dive in, and things shifted for her, in part because they had to. Yeah. But I don't think you can fault any of our moms for following kind of that prescribed role. Many of them were not encouraged to think about the other options that were open to them. And so we can go a long way by encouraging that within our own young men and young women to help them understand that their options are fully open.
Yeah, that's
I will also say that my mom was educated. She had a college degree. That was really, really important in my upbringing. It was kind of the 11th commandment, thou shalt have a college degree in my home growing up, which I appreciate. But that was kind of part of that self-reliance thing. But as soon as you have kids, you quit and watch the kids.
No, yeah. I do appreciate what he said too about that idea that patriarchy harms men. It does. Mm-hmm. It absolutely does. The pressure and the stress of feeling like you have to hold up the economic sky for your family that's something that we really share today in much greater numbers. But I think it can even be more. It's even more about it's not as much about economics for me as it is about satisfaction and that recognition that we all deserve to be able to pursue the goals and dreams that we have for ourselves, and recognizing that women are often socialized differently. And, you know, I've served in young women's callings just within the last few years. Those messages are still being put out. And yet we have to change that. That has to change, right?
Yeah, very much. I just want to say thank you to both of you. I don't have any concluding comments. You guys, I think, have been brilliant in laying out an argument that I think we all need to be aware of and understand this side of things, and not just assume because we're in 2022 that everything's been fixed and it's all better. Any last comments from you, RFM? And then I want to give these women each a chance to say something before we end the show.
No, I echo what you say. I think you did a great job, Jana. Great job, Kelly, articulating your different positions and educating me as well as the audience about what's going on still, as well as a fascinating peek into the past.
Yeah. Yep. Any last thoughts from the two of you?
Probably just for me, I would say, I listened to a podcast a few years ago with Sister Joan Chittister on it. She's a Catholic nun, and she was asked by, On Being, Krista Tippett was asking her, about her own feminism. She claims to be a feminist, and how that works within the Catholic Church and being a nun. And she made a comment that has just stuck with me. She said, the problem is not that it is the way it is, which I don't know, I may disagree with that on some level, but she says the biggest problem is that we don't talk about it. We don't even talk about what this is doing to women within the organization. It's a taboo subject to even bring up in church circles right now. And that is a huge problem with what, as Kelly was saying, all the young women leaving. And if you imagine a young woman right now who is in elementary school, she's growing up in a world that is opening up more and more and more to her possibilities and for her to be a leader. And the gap between that and the church is going to continue to grow. And what are those young women going to grow up with, feeling God's love for them is, or God's esteem for them? This is going to become a bigger and bigger problem. And so I just think that if we can only do one thing, we need to start talking about it. We need to lift the taboo and be able to talk about what this is doing to us, and start asking the questions that we need to ask. If we just continue to do what we're told, this is never going to move forward. We need to be able to ask the questions and have some deeper conversations.
Yeah. Kelly?
I love the idea of honoring women's work, right? And so as much as we talk about this idea of traditional roles, recognize that women work. I was a stay-at-home mom for 16 years with 3 kids, and that was some of the hardest work I've done in my life. And so we honor women in all the places that they reside, right? And women deserve constitutional protection in all the places. So they deserve it at home. They deserve it in the workplace. They deserve it in our communities and our societies, and they deserve it in our religious congregations as well. And so we can all be a part of making that important change. I would suggest start small, right? Start with those awkward conversations that Jana mentioned, like bring it up and talk it through, and be willing to self-reflect and say, how am I maybe contributing to the problem without maybe realizing it? And how can I stand up and speak out for greater respect for women, for men, for all of us?
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Well said, both of you. Thank you for your time tonight. We went a little long, so I hope I can let you guys go and get back to your families. But just for the audience, hang on for a few moments. RFM, stay around for a minute. I'm going to let you two ladies go. We're going to wrap up the show, and you guys are changing the world. And so I just appreciate working alongside you guys to share this important information.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Have a
Thanks
great day.
so much, Kelly. Thank you, Jana.
Bye-bye.
Take it easy. RFM, let's talk for a moment about next week. Your thoughts. We're going to do something really cool next week, aren't we?
I think that we are, and it's gelling. I think it's to the point where it's almost solid. Do you want to talk about what's going to happen next week?
Yeah, Maven, do you want to come on for a minute?
Yeah, I think we should have Maven.
Look at that.
Introduced next week.
Hi,
Maven.
What are we doing next week?
I feel like Larry Hagman and I Dream of Jeannie, not to say something overtly sexual, but you all of a sudden you pop up just in the middle of a scene and there she is. And I know that you have something you want to say. So tell us about next week, if you would.
Well, first I turned my volume down because it was said in the chat that my volume was louder than everyone else's. So I'm kind of wondering if the chat can let me know on that. Next week, there's going to be a very special guest, and it's going to be me. The real Maven is going to be coming live, but I want some help from you guys. I just want to know, I guess, what you guys want to know. And I've seen other people do address assumptions. And so since not very much is known about me, I am curious about what your assumptions and guesses may be about me. So at the end of the episode, if you want to put them just in the comments for this one, we'll keep an eye on that. And then we'll go. I'll have some stories. There's one story in particular that I'm getting a lot of encouragement to share. So we'll see how I feel about it. And hopefully it's entertaining.
Yeah, it's entertaining. The question is whether you'll share it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. RFM and I know some of these stories, and we're excited. We're excited for the audience to hear some of them.
We're two of the
I got
people
to tell you,
encouraging.
Maven, I can tell, before I met you, before I saw, and of course I saw you at Thrive and visited with you, but people are going to guess, from your voice that you're younger, and that's true. But man, don't cut Maven short. She has so much light. Oop, hold on.
Was that a height joke, by the way?
No, not at all. Maven has a ton of life experience. She's well-read. She's intelligent. She's articulate, and she does something that amazes me. She is the best multitasker I know in my life. And I'm just really excited for her to get more vulnerable, and for all of us, the viewers, and RFM and I as the host of Mormonism Live, to be able to kind of get to know her better, and to have the audience get to know her better. And Maven, I couldn't be more excited. I know you were sharing with me today that we might play a game next week of one truth and two lies.
Two truths and a lie.
Two truths and a lie. And you rattled off to me the list of all the things that are part of your life experience. And I think the audience is going to have one hell of a time guessing. So we're excited to kind of put that together, and for you to kind of share yourself with the audience, and for them to get to know you.
I'm excited too. I have mixed feelings because the reason why I'm going to be the guest is because I'm going to be telling my family sometime before the weekend. I'm going to tell them all the stuff. And so then that was the biggest reason for me to not show my face anywhere, just so that they weren't blindsided by something, without hearing it from me. So crossing my fingers that it'll go okay-ish.
Yeah.
And when you say all this stuff, you mean your true feelings about the LDS Church?
Yeah, that, and also that I am interacting publicly against it. It's a bit of an extra, probably tough thing to hear.
Cherry on top.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's real life stuff. And I wish you luck this week as you kind of take that on. And we never know how those kinds of situations can go. But
yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah. I feel like I pretty well know my family, and I'm actually not the first of my siblings to leave. But I still, I was thinking about it last night, and I was just like, I really don't know. I really don't know what they're gonna do.
Yeah, you should trust yourself. You'll handle it the right way, and I hope that they respond healthy.
Thank you. Me too. Yeah. And everyone in the chat is being very supportive, and I want to thank you guys for that as well. Thank you so much.
Cool. And over the course of the next,
sorry.
No, go ahead.
And we'll get to see your real face, maybe.
Yes.
Okay, that's going to be exciting. If you've got questions for Maven, if there's things you want to know, if there's things that we can ask that would help you get to know her better, as she helps our show so much, and in so many ways that you don't even understand, helping with outlines and PowerPoints and slideshows. And she really helps keep me and RFM on task, and it's helping to create a better show. And so, Maven, I'm excited for next week, and it'll be a huge step forward for Mormonism Live.
Thanks.
Okay. Have an awesome day, everybody.
Thanks so much, Maven. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everybody. It's been great.
Thank you, everyone.